for stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. This story is about something horrible happens one night at the Villa Rose in Aix-les-baines. No one knows exactly what. The body of a rich old woman who believes in the spirits and owns a fortune in jewels is strangled to death. The maidservant is chloroformed in her room, and the charming young Mlle Celia, who has learned all the tricks of performing séances, has gone without a trace. And the case involves a gang of hardened criminals. Fortunately, the great detective Monsieur Hanaud is taking on the case. He allows a well-meaning, wealthy, middle-aged English tourist named Mr. Ricardo to tag along on the investigation. Hanaud is as shrewd, observant and devious as the criminals. Hanaud held up his hand to check the flow of words, and both read on again. At 3 o'clock on Tuesday afternoon, Madame was driven away in the carriage, and I did not see it return all that evening. Of course, it may have returned to the stables by another road. But it was not unusual for the carriage to take her into Geneva and wait a long time. I went to bed at 11, but in the night Gobbin was restless, and I rose to get him some medicine. We slept in the front of the house, monsieur, and while I was searching for the matches upon the table in the middle of the room, I heard the sound of carriage wheels in the silent street. I went to the window, and, raising a corner of the curtains, looked out. Gobbin called to me fretfully from the bed to know why I did not light the candle and get him what he wanted. I have already told you how fretful sick men can be, always complaining if just for a minute one distracts oneself by looking out of the window. But there, one can do nothing to please them. Yet how right I was to raise the blind and look out of the window. For if I had obeyed my husband, I might have lost 4,000 francs. And 4,000 francs are not to be sneezed at by a poor woman whose husband lies in bed. I saw the carriage stop at Madame Rossignol's house. Almost at once the house door was opened by the old servant, although the hall of the house and all the windows in the front were dark. That was the first thing that surprised me. For when Madame came home late and the house was dark, she used to let herself in with a latch key. Now, in the dark house, in the early morning, a servant was watching for them. It was strange. As soon as the door of the house was opened, the door of the carriage opened too, and a young lady stepped quickly out onto the pavement. The train of her dress caught in the door, and she turned round, stooped, freed it with her hand, and held it up off the ground. The night was clear, and there was a lamp in the street close by the door of Madame Rossignol's house. As she turned, I saw her face under the big green hat. It was very pretty and young, and the hair was fair. She wore a white coat, but it was open in front and showed her evening frock of pale green. When she lifted her skirt, I saw the buckles sparkling on her satin shoes. It was the young lady for whom you are advertising, I am sure. She remained standing just for a moment without moving, while Madame Rossignol got out. I was surprised to see a young lady of such distinction in Madame Rossignol's company. Then, still holding her skirt up, she ran very lightly and quickly across the pavement into the dark house. I thought, monsieur, that she was very anxious not to be seen. So when I saw your advertisement, I was certain that this was the young lady for whom you are searching. I waited for a few moments and saw the carriage drive off towards the stable at the end of the street. But no light went up in any of the rooms in front of the house. And Gobbin was so fretful that I dropped the corner of the blind, lit the candle, and gave him his cooling drink. His watch was on the table at the bedside, and I saw that it was 5 minutes to 3. I will send you a telegram tomorrow, as soon as I am sure at what hour I can leave my husband. Accept, monsieur, I beg you, my most distinguished salutations. Mart Gobbin. Hanaud leant back with an extraordinary look of perplexity upon his face. But to Ricardo the whole story was now clear. Here was an independent witness, without the jealousy or rancors of Helene Vauquier. Nothing could be more damning than her statement. It corroborated those footmarks upon the soil in front of the glass door of the salon. There was nothing to be done except to set about arresting Mlle Celia at once. The facts work with your theory, Hanaud. The young man with the black moustache did not return to the house at Geneva. For somewhere upon the road close to Geneva he met the carriage. He was driving back the car to Aix, and then another thought struck him, but no. He cried, "We are altogether wrong. See." They did not reach home until 5 minutes to 3. 5 minutes to 3. But this demolished the whole of Hanaud's theory about the motorcar. The murderers had left the villa between 11 and 12, probably before 11:30. The car was a machine of 60 horsepower, and the roads were certain to be clear. Yet the travelers only reached their home at 3. Moreover, the car was back in Aix at 4. It was evident they did not travel by the car. "Geneva time is an hour later than French time," said Hanaud shortly. It seemed as if the corroboration of this letter disappointed him. 2:45 in Madame Gobin's house would be 1:45 by our watches here. Hanaud folded up the letter, and rose to his feet. "We will go now, and we will take this letter with us." Hanaud looked about the room, and picked up a glove lying upon a table. "I left this behind me," he said, putting it into his pocket. "By the way, where is the telegram from Mlle Gobin?" "You put it in your letter case." "Oh, did I?" Hanaud took out his letter case and found the telegram within it. His face lightened. "Good," he said emphatically. "For, since we have this telegram, there must have been another message sent from Adèle Rossignol to Aix saying that Mlle Gobin, that busybody, that inquisitive neighbor, who had no doubt seen Ricardo's advertisement, was on her way hither. Oh, it will not be put as crudely as that, but that is what the message will mean. We shall have him," and suddenly his face grew very stern. "I must catch him, for Mlle Gobin's death I cannot forgive. A poor woman meaning no harm, and murdered like a sheep under our noses. No, that I cannot forgive." Ricardo wondered whether it was the actual murder of Mlle Gobin or the fact that he had been beaten and outwitted which Hanaud could not forgive. But discretion kept him silent. "Let us go," said Hanaud. "By the lift, if you please, it will save time." They descended into the hall close by the main door. The body of Mlle Gobin had been removed to the mortuary of the town. The life of the hotel had resumed its course. "Bernard has gone, I suppose?" Hanaud asked of the porter, and, receiving an assent, he walked quickly out of the front door. "But there is a shorter way," said Ricardo, running after him, across the garden at the back and down the steps. "It will make no difference now," said Hanaud. They hurried along the drive and down the road which circled round the hotel and dipped to the town. Behind Hanaud's hotel Ricardo's car was waiting. "We must go first to Bernard's office. The poor man will be at his wits' end to know who was Madame Gobin and what brought her to Aix. Besides, I wish to send a message over the telephone." Hanaud descended and spent 1/4 hour with the commissaire. As he came out he looked at his watch. "We shall be in time, I think," he said. He climbed into the car. "The murder of Mlle Gobin on her way from the station will put our friends at their ease. It will be published, no doubt, in the evening papers, and those good people over there in Geneva will read it with amusement. They do not know that Mlle Gobin wrote a letter yesterday night. Come, let us go." "Where to?" asked Ricardo. "Where to?" exclaimed Hanaud. "Why, of course, to Geneva." Chapter 12: The Aluminum Flask. "I have telephoned to Le Maire, the chef de la Sûreté at Geneva," said Hanaud, as the car sped out of Aix along the road to Annecy. "He will have the house watched. We shall be in time. They will do nothing until dark." But though he spoke confidently, there was a note of anxiety in his voice, and he sat forward in the car, as though he were already straining his eyes to see Geneva. Ricardo was a trifle disappointed. They were on the great journey to Geneva. They were going to arrest Mlle Celia and her accomplices. And Hanaud had not come disguised. Hanaud, in Ricardo's eyes, was hardly living up to the dramatic expedition on which they had set out. It seemed to him that there was something incorrect in the great detective coming out on the chase without a false beard. "But, my dear friend, why shouldn't I?" pleaded Hanaud. We are going to dine together at the restaurant du Nord, over the lake, until it grows dark. It is not pleasant to eat one's soup in a false beard. Have you tried it? Besides, everybody stares so, seeing perfectly well that it is false. Now, I do not want tonight that people should know me for a detective, so I do not go disguised. Humorist, said Mr. Ricardo. There. You have found me out, cried Hanaud, in mock alarm. Besides, I told you this morning that that is precisely what I am. Beyond Annecy, they came to the bridge over the ravine. At the far end of it, the car stopped. A question, a hurried glance into the body of the car, and the officers of the customs stood aside. You see how perfunctory it is, said Hanaud, and with a jerk the car moved on. The jerk threw Hanaud against Mr. Ricardo. Something hard in the detective's pocket knocked against his companion. You have got them, he whispered. What? The handcuffs. Another disappointment awaited Ricardo. A detective without a false beard was bad enough, but that was nothing to a detective without handcuffs. The paraphernalia of justice was sadly lacking. However, Hanaud consoled Mr. Ricardo by showing him the hard thing. It was almost as thrilling as the handcuffs, for it was a loaded revolver. There will be danger, then? Said Ricardo, with a tremor of excitement. I should have brought mine. There would have been danger, my friend, Hanaud objected gravely, if you had brought yours. They reached Geneva as the dusk was falling, and drove straight to the restaurant by the side of the lake and mounted to the balcony on the first floor. A small, stout man sat at a table alone in a corner of the balcony. He rose and held out his hands. My friend, Mlle, the chef de la Sûreté of Geneva, said Hanaud, presenting the little man to his companion. There were as yet only two couples dining in the restaurant, and Hanaud spoke so that neither could overhear him. He sat down at the table. What news? He asked. None, said Mlle. No one has come out of the house, no one has gone in. And if anything happens while we dine? We shall know, said Mlle. Look, there is a man loitering under the trees there. He will strike a match to light his pipe. The hurried conversation was ended. Good, said Hanaud. We will dine, then, and be gay. He called to the waiter and ordered dinner. It was after 7 when they sat down to dinner, and they dined while the dusk deepened. In the street below the lights flashed out, throwing a sheen on the foliage of the trees at the water's side. Upon the dark lake the reflections of lamps rippled and shook. A boat in which musicians sang to music passed by with a cool splash of oars. The green and red lights of the launches glided backwards and forwards. Hanaud alone of the party on the balcony tried to keep the conversation upon a light and general level. But it was plain that even he was overdoing his gaiety. There were moments when a sudden contraction of the muscles would clench his hands and give a spasmodic jerk to his shoulders. He was waiting uneasily, uncomfortably, until darkness should come. Eat, he cried, eat, my friends, playing with his own barely tasted food. And then, at a sentence from Mlle, his knife and fork clattered on his plate, and he sat with a face suddenly grown white. For Mlle said, as though it was no more than a matter of ordinary comment. So Madame D'Auvry's jewels were, after all, never stolen? Hanaud started. You know that? How did you know it? It was in this evening's paper. I bought one on the way here. They were found under the floor of the bedroom. And even as he spoke a newsboy's voice rang out in the street below them. Mlle was alarmed by the look upon his friend's face. Does it matter, Hanaud? He asked, with some solicitude. It matters, and Hanaud rose up abruptly. The boy's voice sounded louder in the street below. The words became distinct to all upon that balcony. The Aix murder. Discovery of the jewels. We must go, Hanaud whispered hoarsely. Here are life and death in the balance, as I believe, and there he pointed down to the little group gathering about the newsboy under the trees. There is the command which way to tip the scales. It was not I who sent it, said Ricardo eagerly. He had no precise idea what Hanaud meant by his words, But he realized that the sooner he exculpated himself from the charge the better. "Of course it was not you. I know that very well," said Hanaud. He called for the bill. "When is that paper published?" "At 7, said Mlle. "They have been crying it in the streets of Geneva, then, for more than half an hour." He sat drumming impatiently upon the table until the bill should be brought. "By heaven, that's clever," he muttered savagely. "There's a man who gets ahead of me at every turn. See, Mlle, I take every care, every precaution, that no message shall be sent. I let it be known, I take careful pains to let it be known, that no message can be sent without detection following, and here's the message sent by the one channel I never thought to guard against and stop. Look." The murder at the Villa Rose and the mystery which hid its perpetration had aroused interest. This new development had quickened it. From the balcony Hanaud could see the groups thickening about the boy and the white sheets of the newspapers in the hands of passers-by. "Everyone in Geneva or near Geneva will know of this message by now." "Who could have told?" asked Ricardo blankly, and Hanaud laughed in his face, but laughed without any merriment. "At last!" he cried, as the waiter brought the bill, and just as he had paid it the light of a match flared up under the trees. "The signal," said Mlle. "Not too quickly," whispered Hanaud. With as much unconcern as each could counterfeit, the three men descended the stairs and crossed the road. Under the trees a fourth man joined them, he who had lighted his pipe. "The coachman, Hippolyte," he whispered, "bought an evening paper at the front door of the house from a boy who came down the street shouting the news." The coachman ran back into the house. "When was this?" asked Mlle. The man pointed to a lad who leaned against the balustrade above the lake, hot and panting for breath. "He came on his bicycle. He has just arrived." "Follow me," said Mlle. 6 yards from where they stood a couple of steps led down from the embankment onto a wooden landing stage, where boats were moored. Mlle, followed by the others, walked briskly down onto the landing stage. An electric launch was waiting. It had an awning and was of the usual type which one hires at Geneva. There were 2 sergeants in plain clothes on board, and a third man, whom Ricardo recognized. "That is the man who found out in whose shop the cord was bought," he said to Hanaud. "Yes, it is Direct. He has been here since yesterday." Mlle and the 3 who followed him stepped into it, and it backed away from the stage and, turning, sped swiftly outwards from Geneva. The gay lights of the shops and the restaurants were left behind, the cool darkness enveloped them, a light breeze blew over the lake, a trail of white and tumbled water lengthened out behind and overhead, in a sky of deepest blue, the bright stars shone like gold. "If only we are in time," said Hanaud, catching his breath. "Yes," answered Mlle, and in both their voices there was a strange note of gravity. Mlle gave a signal after a while, and the boat turned to the shore and reduced its speed. They had passed the big villas. On the bank the gardens of houses narrow, long gardens of a street of small houses reached down to the lake, and to almost each garden there was a rickety landing stage of wood projecting into the lake. Again Mlle gave a signal, and the boat's speed was so much reduced that not a sound of its coming could be heard. It moved over the water like a shadow, with not so much as a curl of white at its bows. Mlle touched Hanaud on the shoulder and pointed to a house in a row of houses. All the windows except 2 upon the second floor and 1 upon the ground floor were in absolute darkness, and over those upper 2 the wooden shutters were closed, but in the shutters there were diamond-shaped holes, and from these holes 2 yellow beams of light, like glowing eyes upon the watch, streamed out and melted in the air. "You are sure that the front of the house is guarded?" asked Hanaud anxiously. "Yes," replied Mlle. Ricardo shivered with excitement. The launch slid noiselessly into the bank and lay hidden under its shadow. Hanaud turned to his associates with his finger to his lips. Something gleamed darkly in his hand. It was the barrel of his revolver. Cautiously the men disembarked and crept up the bank. First came Mlle, then Hanaud, Ricardo followed him, and the 4th man, who had struck the match under the trees, brought up the rear. The other 3 officers remained in the boat. Stooping under the shadow of the side wall of the garden, the invaders stole towards the house. When a bush rustled or a tree whispered in the light wind, Ricardo's heart jumped to his throat. Once Mlle stopped, as though his ears heard a sound which warned him of danger. Then cautiously he crept on again. The garden was a ragged place of unmown lawn and straggling bushes. Behind each one Mr. Ricardo seemed to feel an enemy. Never had he been in so strait a predicament. He, the cultured host of Grosvenor Square, was creeping along under a wall with continental policemen. He was going to raid a sinister house by the Lake of Geneva. It was thrilling. Fear and excitement gripped him in turn and let him go, but always he was sustained by the pride of the man doing an out-of-the-way thing. If only my friends could see me now. The ancient vanity was loud in his bosom. Poor fellows, they were upon yachts in the Solent or on grouse moors in Scotland, or on golf links at North Berg. He alone of them all was tracking malefactors to their doom by Lehman's Lake. From these agreeable reflections Ricardo was shaken. Mlle stopped. The raiders had reached the angle made by the side wall of the garden and the house. A whisper was exchanged, and the party turned and moved along the house wall towards the lighted window on the ground floor. As Mlle reached it he stooped. Then slowly his forehead and his eyes rose above the sill and glanced this way and that into the room. Mr. Ricardo could see his eyes gleaming as the light from the window caught them. His face rose completely over the sill. He stared into the room without care or apprehension, and then dropped again out of the reach of the light. He turned to Hanaud. "The room is empty," he whispered. Hanaud turned to Ricardo. "Pass under the sill, or the light from the window will throw your shadow upon the lawn." The party came to the back door of the house. Mlle tried the handle of the door, and to his surprise it yielded. They crept into the passage. The last man closed the door noiselessly, locked it, and removed the key. A panel of light shone upon the wall a few paces ahead. The door of the lighted room was open. As Ricardo stepped silently past it, he looked in. It was a parlor meanly furnished. Hanaud touched him on the arm and pointed to the table. Ricardo had seen the objects at which Hanaud pointed often enough without uneasiness, but now, in this silent house of crime, they had the most sinister and appalling aspect. There was a tiny phial half full of a dark brown liquid, beside it a little leather case lay open, and across the case, ready for use or waiting to be filled, was a bright morphia needle. Ricardo felt the cold creep along his spine, and shivered. "Come," whispered Hanaud. They reached the foot of a flight of stairs, and cautiously mounted it. They came out in a passage which ran along the side of the house from the back to the front. It was unlighted, but they were now on the level of the street, and a fan-shaped glass window over the front door admitted a pale light. There was a street lamp near to the door, Ricardo remembered. For by the light of it Mart Gobbin had seen Celia Harland run so nimbly into this house. For a moment the men in the passage held their breath. Someone strode heavily by on the pavement outside, to Mr. Ricardo's ear a most companionable sound. Then a clock upon a church struck the half-hour musically, distantly. It was 8:30. And a second afterwards a tiny bright light shone. Hanaud was directing the light of a pocket electric torch to the next flight of stairs. Here the steps were carpeted, and once more the men crept up. One after another they came out upon the next landing. It ran, like those below it, along the side of the house from the back to the front, and the doors were all upon their left hand. From beneath the door nearest to them a yellow line of light streamed out. They stood in the darkness listening. But not a sound came from behind the door. Was this room empty, too? In each one's mind was the fear that the birds had flown. Mlle carefully took the handle of the door and turned it. Very slowly and cautiously he opened the door. A strong light beat out through the widening gap upon his face. And then, though his feet did not move, his shoulders and his face drew back. The action was significant enough. This room, at all events, was not empty. But of what Mlle saw in the room his face gave no hint. He opened the door wider, and now Hanaud saw. Ricardo, trembling with excitement, watched him. But again there was no expression of surprise, consternation, or delight. He stood stolidly and watched. Then he turned to Ricardo, placed a finger on his lips, and made room. Ricardo crept on tiptoe to his side. And now he too could look in. He saw a brightly lit bedroom with a made bed. On his left were the shuttered windows overlooking the lake. On his right in the partition wall a door stood open. Through the door he could see a dark, windowless closet, with a small bed from which the bedclothes hung and trailed upon the floor, as though someone had been but now roughly dragged from it. On a table, close by the door, lay a big green hat with a brown ostrich feather, and a white cloak. But the amazing spectacle which kept him riveted was just in front of him. An old hag of a woman was sitting in a chair with her back towards them. She was mending with a big needle the holes in an old sack, and while she bent over her work she crooned to herself some French song. Every now and then she raised her eyes, for in front of her, under her charge, Mlle Celia, the girl of whom Hanaud was in search, lay helpless upon a sofa. The train of her delicate green frock swept the floor. She was dressed as Helene Vauquier had described. Her gloved hands were tightly bound behind her back, her feet were crossed so that she could not have stood, and her ankles were cruelly strapped together. Over her face and eyes a piece of coarse sacking was stretched like a mask, and the ends were roughly sewn together at the back of her head. She lay so still that, but for the labouring of her bosom and a tremor which now and again shook her limbs, the watchers would have thought her dead. She made no struggle of resistance, she lay quiet and still. Once she writhed, but it was with the uneasiness of one in pain, and the moment she stirred the old woman's hand went out to a bright aluminium flask which stood on a little table at her side. "Keep quiet, little one," she ordered in a careless, chiding voice, and she rapped with the flask peremptorily upon the table. Immediately, as though the tapping had some strange message of terror for the girl's ear, she stiffened her whole body and lay rigid. "I am not ready for you yet, little fool," said the old woman, and she bent again to her work. Ricardo's brain whirled. Here was the girl whom they had come to arrest, who had sprung from the salon with so much activity of youth across the stretch of grass, who had run so quickly and lightly across the pavement into this very house, so that she should not be seen. And now she was lying in her fine and delicate attire a captive, at the mercy of the very people who were her accomplices. Suddenly a scream rang out in the gardener's shrill, loud scream, close beneath the windows. The old woman sprang to her feet. The girl on the sofa raised her head. The old woman took a step towards the window, and then she swiftly turned towards the door. She saw the men upon the threshold. She uttered a bellow of rage. There is no other word to describe the sound. It was not a human cry, it was the bellow of an angry animal. She reached out her hand towards the flask, but before she could grasp it Hanaud seized her. She burst into a torrent of foul oaths. Hanaud flung her across to Le Maire's officer, who dragged her from the room. "Quick," said Hanaud, pointing to the girl, who was now struggling helplessly upon the sofa. "Mlle Celia." Ricardo cut the stitches of the sacking. Hanaud unstrapped her hands and feet. They helped her to sit up. She shook her hands in the air as though they tortured her, and then, in a piteous, whimpering voice, like a child's, she babbled incoherently and whispered prayers. Suddenly the prayers ceased. She sat stiff, with eyes fixed and staring. She was watching Le Maire, and she was watching him fascinated with terror. He was holding in his hand the large, bright aluminium flask. He poured a little of the contents very carefully onto a piece of the sack, and then with an exclamation of anger he turned towards Hanaud. But Hanaud was supporting Celia, and so, as Le Maire turned abruptly towards him with the flask in his hand, he turned abruptly towards Celia too. She wrenched herself from Hanaud's arms, she shrank violently away. Her white face flushed scarlet and grew white again. She screamed loudly, terribly, and after the scream she uttered a strange, weak sigh, and so fell sideways in a swoon. Hanaud caught her as she fell. A light broke over his face. "Now I understand," he cried. "Good God! That's horrible." Chapter 13. In the house at Geneva. It was well, Mr. Ricardo thought, that someone understood. For himself, he frankly admitted that he did not. Indeed, in his view the first principles of reasoning seemed to be set at naught. It was obvious from the solicitude with which Celia Harland was surrounded that everyone except himself was convinced of her innocence. Yet it was equally obvious that anyone who bore in mind the 8 points he had tabulated against her must be convinced of her guilt. Yet again, if she were guilty, how did it happen that she had been so mishandled by her accomplices? He was not allowed, however, to reflect upon these remarkable problems. He had too busy a time of it. At one moment he was running to fetch water wherewith to bathe Celia's forehead. At another, when he had returned with the water, he was distracted by the appearance of Dorette, the inspector from Aix, in the doorway. "We have them both," he said, Hippolyta and the woman. "They were hiding in the garden." "So I thought," said Hanaud, "when I saw the door open downstairs, and the morphine needle on the table." Mlle turned to one of the officers. "Let them be taken with old Jeanne in cabs to the depot." And when the man had gone upon his errand, Mlle spoke to Hanaud. "You will stay here tonight to arrange for their transfer to Aix?" "I will leave Dorette behind," said Hanaud. "I am needed at Aix. We will make a formal application for the prisoners." He was kneeling by Celia's side and awkwardly dabbing her forehead with a wet handkerchief. He raised a warning hand. Celia Harland moved and opened her eyes. She sat up on the sofa, shivering, and looked with dazed and wondering eyes from one to another of the strangers who surrounded her. She searched in vain for a familiar face. "You are amongst good friends, Mlle Celia," said Hanaud with great gentleness. "Oh, I wonder. I wonder," she cried piteously. "Be very sure of it," he said heartily, and she clung to the sleeve of his coat with desperate hands. "I suppose you are friends," she said, "else why?" And she moved her numbed limbs to make certain that she was free. She looked about the room. Her eyes fell upon the sack and widened with terror. "They came to me a little while ago in that cupboard there, Adele and the old woman Jeanne. They made me get up. They told me they were going to take me away. They brought my clothes and dressed me in everything I wore when I came, so that no single trace of me might be left behind. Then they tied me." She tore off her gloves and showed them her lacerated wrists. "I think they meant to kill me horribly." And she caught her breath and whimpered like a child. Her spirit was broken. "My poor girl, all that is over," said Hanaud. And he stood up. But at the first movement he made she cried incisively, "No," and tightened the clutch of her fingers upon his sleeve. "But, mademoiselle, you are safe," he said, with a smile. She stared at him stupidly. It seemed the words had no meaning for her. She would not let him go. It was only the feel of his coat within the clutch of her fingers which gave her any comfort. "I want to be sure that I am safe," she said, with a wan little smile. "Tell me, mademoiselle, what have you had to eat and drink during the last 2 days?" "Is it 2 days?" she asked. "I was in the dark there. I did not know. A little bread, a little water." "That's what is wrong," said Hanaud. "Come, let us go from here." "Yes, yes," Celia cried eagerly. She rose to her feet and tottered. Hanaud put his arm about her. "You are very kind," she said in a low voice, and again doubt looked out from her face and disappeared. "I am sure that I can trust you." Ricardo fetched her cloak and slipped it on her shoulders. Then he brought her hat, and she pinned it on. She turned to Hanaud. Unconsciously familiar words rose to her lips. "Is it straight?" she asked. And Hanaud laughed outright, and in a moment Celia smiled herself. Supported by Hanaud she stumbled down the stairs to the garden. As they passed the open door of the lighted parlour at the back of the house, Hanaud turned back to Mlle and pointed silently to the morphine needle and the file. Mlle nodded his head, and going into the room took them away. They went out again into the garden. Celia Harland threw back her head to the stars and drew in a deep breath of the cool night air. "I did not think," she said in a low voice, "to see the stars again." They walked slowly down the length of the garden, and Hanaud lifted her into the launch. She turned and caught his coat. You must come too, she said stubbornly. Hanaud sprang in beside her. For tonight, he said gaily, I am your papa. Ricardo and the others followed, and the launch moved out over the lake under the stars. The bow was turned towards Geneva, the water tumbled behind them like white fire, the night breeze blew fresh upon their faces. They disembarked at the landing stage, and then Lemaire bowed to Celia and took his leave. Hanaud led Celia up onto the balcony of the restaurant and ordered supper. There were people still dining at the tables. One party indeed sitting late over their coffee Ricardo recognized with a kind of shock. They had taken their places, the very places in which they now sat, before he and Hanaud and Lemaire left the restaurant upon their expedition of rescue. Into that short interval of time so much that was eventful had been crowded. Hanaud leaned across the table to Celia and said in a low voice, Mademoiselle, if I may suggest it, it would be as well if you put on your gloves, otherwise they may notice your wrists. Celia followed his advice. She ate some food and drank a glass of champagne. A little color returned to her cheeks. You are very kind to me, you and Monsieur your friend, she said, with a smile towards Ricardo. But for you, and her voice shook. Hush, said Hanaud, all that is over, we will not speak of it. Celia looked out across the road onto the trees, of which the dark foliage was brightened and made pale by the lights of the restaurant. Out on the water someone was singing. It seems impossible to me, she said in a low voice, that I am here, in the open air, and free. Hanaud looked at his watch. Mlle Celia, it is past 10 o'clock. Ricardo's car is waiting there under the trees. I want you to drive back to Aix. I have taken rooms for you at an hotel, and there will be a nurse from the hospital to look after you. Thank you, monsieur, she said, you have thought of everything. But I shall not need a nurse. But you will have a nurse, said Hanaud firmly. You feel stronger now, yes, but when you lay your head upon your pillow, mademoiselle, it will be a comfort to you to know that you have her within call. And in a day or two, he added gently, you will perhaps be able to tell us what happened on Tuesday night at the Villa Rose? Celia covered her face with her hands for a few moments, then she drew them away and said simply, Yes, monsieur, I will tell you. Hanaud bowed to her with a genuine deference. Thank you, mademoiselle, he said, and in his voice there was a strong ring of sympathy. They went downstairs and entered Ricardo's motor car. I want to send a telephone message, said Hanaud, if you will wait here. No, cried Celia decisively, and she again laid hold of his coat, with a pretty imperiousness, as though he belonged to her. But I must, said Hanaud with a laugh. Then I will come too, said Celia, and she opened the door and set a foot upon the step. You will not, mademoiselle, said Hanaud, with a laugh. Will you take your foot back into that car? That is better. Now you will sit with your friend, Ricardo, whom, by the way, I have not yet introduced to you. He is a very good friend of yours, mademoiselle, and will in the future be a still better one. Ricardo felt his conscience rather heavy within him, for he had come out to Geneva with the fixed intention of arresting her, the most dangerous criminal. Even now he could not understand how she could be innocent of a share in Madame d'Auvry's murder. But Hanaud evidently thought she was. And since Hanaud thought so, why, it was better to say nothing if one was sensitive to jibes. So Ricardo sat and talked with her while Hanaud ran back into the restaurant. It mattered very little, however, what he said, for Celia's eyes were fixed upon the doorway through which Hanaud had disappeared. And when he came back she was quick to turn the handle of the door. Now, mademoiselle, we will wrap you up in Ricardo's spare motor coat and cover your knees with a rug and put you between us, and then you can go to sleep. The car sped through the streets of Geneva. Celia Harland, with a little sigh of relief, nestled down between the two men. If I knew you better, she said to Hanaud, I should tell you what, of course, I do not tell you now that I feel as if I had a big Newfoundland dog with me. Mlle Celia, said Hanaud, and his voice told her that he was moved, that is a very pretty thing which you have said to me. The lights of the city fell away behind them. Now only a glow in the sky spoke of Geneva. Now even that was gone, and with a smooth continuous purr the car raced through the cool darkness. The great headlamps threw a bright circle of light before them, and the road slipped away beneath the wheels like a running tide. Celia fell asleep. Even when the car stopped at the Pont de la Caille she did not waken. The door was opened, a search for contraband was made, the book was signed, still she did not wake. The car sped on. "You see, coming into France is a different affair," said Hanaud. "Yes," replied Ricardo, "still, I will own it, you caught me napping yesterday." "I did?" exclaimed Ricardo joyfully. "You did," returned Hanaud. "I had never heard of the Pont de la Caille. But you will not mention it? You will not ruin me?" "I will not," answered Ricardo, superb in his magnanimity. "You are a good detective." "Oh, thank you. Thank you," cried Hanaud in a voice which shook surely with emotion. He wrung Ricardo's hand. He wiped an imaginary tear from his eye. And still Celia slept. Ricardo looked at her. He said to Hanaud in a whisper, "Yet I do not understand. The car, though no serious search was made, must still have stopped at the Pont de la Caille on the Swiss side. Why did she not cry for help then? One cry and she was safe. A movement even was enough. Do you understand?" Hanaud nodded his head. "I think so," he answered, with a very gentle look at Celia. "Yes, I think so." When Celia was aroused she found that the car had stopped before the door of an hotel, and that a woman in the dress of a nurse was standing in the doorway. "You can trust Marie," said Hanaud. And Celia turned as she stood upon the ground and gave her hands to the two men. "Thank you. Thank you both," she said in a trembling voice. She looked at Hanaud and nodded her head. "You understand why I thank you so very much?" "Yes," said Hanaud. "But, mademoiselle," and he bent over the car and spoke to her quietly, holding her hand, "there is always a big Newfoundland dog in the worst of troubles, if only you will look for him. I tell you so, I, who belong to the Sûreté in Paris. Do not lose heart." And in his mind he added, "God forgive me for the lie." He shook her hand and let it go, and gathering up her skirt she went into the hall of the hotel. Hanaud watched her as she went. She was to him a lonely and pathetic creature, in spite of the nurse who bore her company. "You must be a good friend to that young girl, Ricardo," he said. "Let us drive to your hotel." "Yes," said Ricardo. And as they went the curiosity which all the way from Geneva had been smouldering within him burst into flame. "Will you explain to me one thing?" he asked. "When the scream came from the garden you were not surprised. Indeed, you said that when you saw the open door and the morphia needle on the table of the little room downstairs you thought Adele and the man Hippolyta were hiding in the garden." "Yes, I did think so." "Why? And why did the publication that the jewels had been discovered so alarm you?" "Ah," said Hanaud. "Did not you understand that? Yet it is surely clear and obvious, if you once grant that the girl was innocent, was a witness of the crime, and was now in the hands of the criminals. Grant me those premises, Ricardo, for a moment, and you will see that we had just one chance of finding the girl alive in Geneva. From the first I was sure of that. What was the one chance? Why, this. She might be kept alive on the chance that she could be forced to tell what, by the way, she did not know, namely, the place where Madame d'Auvry's valuable jewels were secreted. Now, follow this. We, the police, find the jewels and take charge of them. Let that news reach the house in Geneva, and on the same night Mlle Celia loses her life, and not very pleasantly. They have no further use for her. She is merely a danger to them. So I take my precautions, never mind for the moment what they were. I take care that if the murderer is in Aix and gets wind of our discovery he shall not be able to communicate his news." "The post office would have stopped letters or telegrams," said Ricardo. "I understand." "On the contrary," replied Hanaud. "No, I took my precautions, which were of quite a different kind, before I knew the house in Geneva or the name of Rossignol. But one way of communication I did not think of. I did not think of the possibility that the news might be sent to a newspaper, which of course would publish it and cry it through the streets of Geneva. The moment I heard the news I knew we must hurry. The garden of the house ran down to the lake. A means of disposing of Mlle Celia was close at hand. And the night had fallen. As it was, we arrived just in time, and no earlier than just in time. The paper had been bought, the message had reached the house. Mlle Celia was no longer of any use, and every hour she stayed in that house was of course an hour of danger to her captors. What were they going to do? Asked Ricardo. Hanaud shrugged his shoulders. It is not pretty what they were going to do. We reached the garden in our launch. At that moment Hippolyta and Adele, who is most likely Hippolyta's wife, are in the lighted parlor on the basement floor. Adele is preparing her morphia needle. Hippolyta is going to get ready the rowing boat which was tied at the end of the landing stage. Quietly as we came into the bank, they heard or saw us. They ran out and hid in the garden, having no time to lock the garden door, or perhaps not daring to lock it lest the sound of the key should reach our ears. We find that door upon the latch, the door of the room open, on the table lies the morphia needle. Upstairs lies Mlle Celia. She is helpless, she cannot see what they are meaning to do. But she could cry out, exclaimed Ricardo. She did not even do that. No, my friend, she could not cry out, replied Hanaud very seriously. I know why. She could not. No living man or woman could. Rest assured of that. Ricardo was mystified, but since the captain of the ship would not show his observation, he knew it would be in vain to press him. Well, while Adele was preparing her morphia needle and Hippolyta was about to prepare the boat, Jeanne upstairs was making her preparation too. She was mending a sack. Did you see Mlle Celia's eyes and face when first she saw that sack? Ah. She understood. They meant to give her a dose of morphia, and, as soon as she became unconscious, they were going perhaps to take some terrible precaution. Hanaud paused for a second. I only say perhaps as to that. But certainly they were going to sew her up in that sack, row her well out across the lake, fix a weight to her feet, and drop her quietly overboard. She was to wear everything which she had brought with her to the house. Mlle Celia would have disappeared forever, and left not even a ripple upon the water to trace her by. Ricardo clenched his hands. But that's horrible, he cried, and as he uttered the words the car swerved into the drive and stopped before the door of the Hotel Majestic. Ricardo sprang out. A feeling of remorse seized hold of him. All through that evening he had not given one thought to Harry Wethermill, so utterly had the excitement of each moment engrossed his mind. He will be glad to know, cried Ricardo. Tonight, at all events, he shall sleep. I ought to have telegraphed to him from Geneva that we and Miss Celia were coming back. He ran up the steps into the hotel. I took care that he should know, said Hanaud, as he followed in Ricardo's steps. Then the message could not have reached him, else he would have been expecting us, replied Ricardo, as he hurried into the office, where a clerk sat at his books. Is Mr. Wethermill in? He asked. The clerk eyed him strangely. Mr. Wethermill was arrested this evening, he said. Ricardo stepped back. Arrested? When? At 10:25, replied the clerk shortly. Ah, said Hanaud quietly. That was my telephone message. Ricardo stared in stupefaction at his companion. Arrested? He cried. Arrested? But what for? For the murders of Marthe Gobin and Madame Dovry, said Hanaud. Good night. Chapter 14. Mr. Ricardo is bewildered. Ricardo passed a most tempestuous night. He was tossed amongst dark problems. Now it was Harry Wethermill who beset him. He repeated and repeated the name, trying to grasp the new and sinister suggestion which, if Hanaud were right, its sound must henceforth bear. Of course Hanaud might be wrong. Only, if he were wrong, how had he come to suspect Harry Wethermill? What had first directed his thoughts to that seemingly heartbroken man? And when? Certain recollections became vivid in Mr. Ricardo's mind, The luncheon at the Villa Rose, for instance. Hanaud had been so insistent that the woman with the red hair was to be found in Geneva, had so clearly laid it down that a message, a telegram, a letter from Aix to Geneva, would enable him to lay his hands upon the murderer in Aix. He was isolating the house in Geneva even so early in the history of his investigations, even so soon he suspected Harry Wethermill. Brains and audacity, yes, these two qualities he had stipulated in the criminal. Ricardo now for the first time understood the trend of all Hanaud's talk at that luncheon. He was putting Harry Wethermill upon his guard, he was immobilizing him, he was fettering him in precautions, with a subtle skill he was forcing him to isolate himself. And he was doing it deliberately to save the life of Celia Harland in Geneva. Once Ricardo lifted himself up with the hair stirring on his scalp. He himself had been with Wethermill in the Baccarat rooms on the very night of the murder. They had walked together up the hill to the hotel. It could not be that Harry Wethermill was guilty. And yet, he suddenly remembered, they had together left the rooms at an early hour. It was only 10 o'clock when they had separated in the hall, when they had gone, each to his own room. There would have been time for Wethermill to reach the Villa Rose and do his dreadful work upon that night before 12, if all had been arranged beforehand, if all went as it had been arranged. And as he thought upon the careful planning of that crime, and remembered Wethermill's easy chatter as they had strolled from table to table in the Villa des Fleurs, Ricardo shuddered. Though he encouraged a taste for the bizarre, it was with an effort. He was naturally of an orderly mind, and to touch the eerie or inhuman caused him a physical discomfort. So now he marveled in a great uneasiness at the calm placidity with which Wethermill had talked, his arm in his, while the load of so dark a crime to be committed within the hour lay upon his mind. Each minute he must have been thinking, with a swift spasm of the heart, should such a precaution fail, should such or such an unforeseen thing intervene, yet there had been never a sign of disturbance, never a hint of any disquietude. Then Ricardo's thoughts turned as he tossed upon his bed to Celia Harland, a tragic and a lonely figure. He recalled the look of tenderness upon her face when her eyes had met Harry Wethermill's across the Baccarat table in the Villa des Fleurs. He gained some insight into the reason why she had clung so desperately to Hanaud's coat sleeve yesterday. Not merely had he saved her life, she was lying with all her world of trust and illusion broken about her, and Hanaud had raised her up. She had found someone whom she trusted, the big Newfoundland dog, as she expressed it. Mr. Ricardo was still thinking of Celia Harland when the morning came. He fell asleep, and awoke to find Hanaud by his bed. "You will be wanted today," said Hanaud. Ricardo got up and walked down from the hotel with the detective. The front door faces the hillside of Montrevard, and on this side Mr. Ricardo's rooms looked out. The drive from the front door curves round the end of the long building and joins the road, which then winds down towards the town past the garden at the back of the hotel. Down this road the two men walked, while the supporting wall of the garden upon their right hand grew higher and higher above their heads. They came to a steep flight of steps which makes a short cut from the hotel to the road, and at the steps Hanaud stopped. "Do you see?" he said. "On the opposite side there are no houses, there is only a wall. Behind the wall there are climbing gardens and the ground falls steeply to the turn of the road below. There's a flight of steps leading down which corresponds with the flight of steps from the garden. Very often there's a sergeant de ville stationed on the top of the steps. But there was not one there yesterday afternoon at 3. Behind us is the supporting wall of the hotel garden. Well, look about you. We cannot be seen from the hotel. There's not a soul in sight. Yes, there's someone coming up the hill, but we have been standing here quite long enough for you to stab me and get back to your coffee on the veranda of the hotel." Ricardo started back. "Mart Gobbin!" he cried. "It was here, then?" Hanaud nodded. "When we returned from the station in your motorcar and went up to your rooms we passed Harry Wethermill sitting upon the veranda over the garden drinking his coffee. He had the news then that Mart Gobbin was on her way. But you had isolated the house in Geneva. How could he have the news?" exclaimed Ricardo, whose brain was whirling. "I had isolated the house from him, in the sense that he dared not communicate with his accomplices. That is what you have to remember. He could not even let them know that they must not communicate with him. So he received a telegram. It was carefully worded. No doubt he had arranged the wording of any message with the care which was used in all the preparations. It ran like this, and Hanaud took a scrap of paper from his pocket and read out from it a copy of the telegram. Agent arrives X 3.7 to negotiate purchase of your patent. The telegram was handed in at Geneva station at 12:45, 5 minutes after the train had left which carried Marte Gobin to Aix, and more. It was handed in by a man strongly resembling Hippolyte taste that we know. That was madness, said Ricardo. But what else could they do over there in Geneva? They did not know that Harry Wethermill was suspected. Harry Wethermill had no idea of it himself. But, even if they had known, they must take the risk. Put yourself into their place for a moment. They had seen my advertisement about Celia Harland in the Geneva paper. Marte Gobin, that busybody who was always watching her neighbors, was no doubt watched herself. They see her leave the house, an unusual proceeding for her with her husband ill, as her own letter tells us. Hippolyte follows her to the station, sees her take her ticket to Aix and mount into the train. He must guess at once that she saw Celia Harland enter their house, that she is traveling to Aix with the information of her whereabouts. At all costs she must be prevented from giving that information. At all risks, therefore, the warning telegram must be sent to Harry Wethermill. Ricardo recognized the force of the argument. If only you had heard of the telegram yesterday in time, he cried. Ah, yes. Hanaud agreed. But it was only sent off at 1:15. It was delivered to Wethermill and a copy was sent to the prefecture, but the telegram was delivered first. When was it delivered to Wethermill? Asked Ricardo. At 3. We had already left for the station. Wethermill was sitting on the veranda. The telegram was brought to him there. It was brought by a waiter in the hotel who remembers the incident very well. Wethermill has 7 minutes and the time it will take for Marte Gobin to drive from the station to the Majestic. What does he do? He runs up first to your rooms, very likely not yet knowing what he must do. He runs up to verify his telegram. Are you sure of that? Cried Ricardo. How can you be? You were at the station with me. What makes you sure? Hanaud produced a brown kid glove from his pocket. That is your glove, you told me so yesterday. I told you so, replied Hanaud calmly, but it is not my glove. It is Wethermill's, there are his initials stamped upon the lining, see? I picked up that glove in your room, after we had returned from the station. It was not there before. He went to your rooms. No doubt he searched for a telegram. Fortunately he did not examine your letters, or Marte Gobin would never have spoken to us as she did after she was dead. Then what did he do? Asked Ricardo eagerly, and, though Hanaud had been with him at the entrance to the station all this while, he asked the question in absolute confidence that the true answer would be given to him. He returned to the veranda wondering what he should do. He saw us come back from the station in the motor car and go up to your room. We were alone. Marte Gobin, then, was following. There was his chance. Marte Gobin must not reach us, must not tell her news to us. He ran down the garden steps to the gate. No one could see him from the hotel. Very likely he hid behind the trees, whence he could watch the road. A cab comes up the hill, there's a woman in it, not quite the kind of woman who stays at your hotel, Ricardo. Yet she must be going to your hotel, for the road ends. The driver is nodding on his box, refusing to pay any heed to his fare lest again she should bid him hurry. His horse is moving at a walk. Wethermill puts his head in at the window and asks if she has come to see him. Ricardo. Anxious for her 4,000 francs, she answers yes. Perhaps he steps into the cab, perhaps as he walks by the side he strikes, and strikes hard and strikes surely. Long before the cab reaches the hotel he is back again on the veranda. Yes, said Ricardo, it's the daring of which you spoke which made the crime possible, the same daring which made him seek your help. That was unexampled. No, replied Hanaud. There's an historic crime in your own country, monsieur. Cries for help were heard in a by street of a town. When people ran to answer them, a man was found kneeling by a corpse. It was the kneeling man who cried for help, but it was also the kneeling man who did the murder. I remembered that when I first began to suspect Harry Wethermill. Ricardo turned eagerly. And when did you first begin to suspect Harry Wethermill? Hanaud smiled and shook his head. That you shall know in good time. I am the captain of the ship. His voice took on a deeper note. But I prepare you. Listen. Daring and brains, those were the property of Harry Wethermill, yes. But it is not he who is the chief actor in the crime. Of that I am sure. He was no more than one of the instruments. One of the instruments? Used, then, by whom? Asked Ricardo. By my Normandy peasant woman, M. Ricardo, said Hanaud. Yes, there's the dominating figure, cruel, masterful, relentless, that strange woman, Helene Vauquier. You are surprised? You will see. It is not the man of intellect and daring, it's my peasant woman who is at the bottom of it all. But she's free, exclaimed Ricardo. You let her go free. Free, repeated Ricardo. She was driven straight from the Villa Rose to the depot. She has been kept a secret ever since. Ricardo stared in amazement. Already you knew of her guilt? Already she had lied to me in her description of Adele Rossignol. Do you remember what she said? A black-haired woman with beady eyes, and I only 5 minutes before had picked up from the table this. He opened his pocketbook, and took from an envelope a long strand of red hair. But it was not only because she lied that I had her taken to the depot. A pot of cold cream had disappeared from the room of Mlle Celia. Then Perrichet after all was right. Perrichet after all was quite wrong not to hold his tongue. For in that pot of cold cream, as I was sure, were hidden those valuable diamond earrings which Mlle Celia habitually wore. The two men had reached the square in front of the Établissement des Bains. Ricardo dropped onto a bench and wiped his forehead. But I am in a maze, he cried. My head turns round. I don't know where I am. Hanaud stood in front of Ricardo, smiling. He was not displeased with his companion's bewilderment, it was all so much of tribute to himself. I am the captain of the ship, he said. His smile irritated Ricardo, who spoke impatiently. I should be very glad, he said, if you would tell me how you discovered all these things. And what it was that the little salon on the first morning had to tell to you? And why Celia Harland ran from the glass doors across the grass to the motor car and again from the carriage into the house on the lake? Why she did not resist yesterday evening? Why she did not cry for help? How much of Helene Vauquier's evidence was true and how much false? For what reason Wethermill concerned himself in this affair? Oh! And 1,000 things which I don't understand. Ah, the cushions, and the scrap of paper, and the aluminium flask, said Hanaud, and the triumph faded from his face. He spoke now to Ricardo with a genuine friendliness. You must not be angry with me if I keep you in the dark for a little while. I, too, Mr. Ricardo, have artistic inclinations. I will not spoil the remarkable story which I think Mlle Celia will be ready to tell us. Afterwards I will willingly explain to you what I read in the evidences of the room, and what so greatly puzzled me then. But it is not the puzzle or its solution, he said modestly, which is most interesting here. Consider the people. Madame Dovry, the old, rich, ignorant woman, with her superstitions and her generosity, her desire to converse with Madame de Montespan and the great ladies of the past, and her love of a young, fresh face about her, Helene Vauquier, the maid with her 6 years of confidential service, who finds herself suddenly supplanted and made to tend and dress in dainty frocks, the girl who has supplanted her, the young girl herself, that poor child, with her love of fine clothes, the bohemian who, brought up amidst trickeries and practicing them as a profession, looking upon them and upon misery and starvation and despair as the commonplaces of life, keeps a simplicity and a delicacy and a freshness which would have withered in a day had she been brought up otherwise. Harry Wethermill, the courted and successful man of genius. Just imagine, if you can, what his feelings must have been, when in Madame Dovry's bedroom, with the woman he had uselessly murdered lying rigid beneath the sheet, he saw me raise the block of wood from the inlaid floor and take out one by one those jewel cases for which less than 12 hours before he had been ransacking that very room. But what he must have felt! And to give no sign. Oh, these people are the interesting problems in this story. Let us hear what happened on that terrible night. The puzzle that can wait. In Mr. Ricardo's view, Hanaud was proved right. The extraordinary and appalling story which was gradually unrolled of what had happened on that night of Tuesday in the Villa Rose exceeded in its grim interest all the mystery of the puzzle. But it was not told at once. The trouble at first with Mlle Celia was a fear of sleep. She dared not sleep even with a light in the room and a nurse at her bedside. When her eyes were actually closing, she would force herself desperately back into the living world. For when she slept, she dreamed through again that dark and dreadful night of Tuesday and the 2 days which followed it, until at some moment endurance snapped and she woke up screaming. But youth, a good constitution, and a healthy appetite had their way with her in the end. She told her share of the story. She told what happened. There was apparently one terrible scene when she was confronted with Harry Wethermill in the office of Monsieur Fleuriot, the juge d'instruction, and on her knees, with the tears streaming down her face, besought him to confess the truth. For a long while he held out. And then there came a strange and human turn to the affair. Adèle Rossignol, or, to give her real name, Adèle Tace, the wife of Hippolyta, had conceived a veritable passion for Harry Wethermill. He was of a not uncommon type, cold and callous in himself, yet with the power to provoke passion in women. And Adèle Tace, as the story was told of how Harry Wethermill had paid his court to Celia Harland, was seized with a vindictive jealousy. Hanaud was not surprised. He knew the woman criminal of his country, brutal, passionate, treacherous. The anonymous letters in a woman's handwriting which descend upon the Rue de Jérusalem, and betray the men who have committed thefts, had left him no illusions upon that figure in the history of crime. Adèle Rossignol ran forward to confess, so that Harry Wethermill might suffer to the last possible point of suffering. Then at last Wethermill gave in and, broken down by the ceaseless interrogations of the magistrate, confessed in his turn too. The one, and the only one, who stood firmly throughout and denied the crime was Helene Vauquier. Her thin lips were kept contemptuously closed, whatever the others might admit. With a white, hard face, quietly and respectfully she faced the magistrate week after week. She was the perfect picture of a servant who knew her place. And nothing was wrung from her. But without her help the story became complete. And Ricardo was at pains to write it out. Chapter 15: Celia's story. The story begins with the explanation of that circumstance which had greatly puzzled Mr. Ricardo, Celia's entry into the household of Madame d'Auvry. Celia's father was a Captain Harland, of a marching regiment, who had little beyond good looks and excellent manners wherewith to support his position. He was extravagant in his tastes, and of an easy mind in the presence of embarrassments. To his other disadvantages he added that of falling in love with a pretty girl no better off than himself. They married, and Celia was born. For 9 years they managed, through the wife's constant devotion, to struggle along and to give their daughter an education. Then, however, Celia's mother broke down under the strain and died. Captain Harland, a couple of years later, went out of the service with discredit, passed through the bankruptcy court, and turned showman. His line was thought reading. He enlisted the services of his daughter, taught her the tricks of his trade, and became the great Fortinbras of the music halls. Captain Harland would move amongst the audience, asking the spectators in a whisper to think of a number or of an article in their pockets, after the usual fashion, while the child, in her short frock, with her long fair hair tied back with a ribbon, would stand blindfolded upon the platform and reel off the answers with astonishing rapidity. She was singularly quick, singularly receptive. The undoubted cleverness of the performance, and the beauty of the child, brought to them a temporary prosperity. The great Fortinbras rose from the music halls to the assembly rooms of provincial towns. The performance became genteel, and ladies flocked to the matinees. The great Fortinbras dropped his pseudonym and became once more Captain Harland. As Celia grew up, he tried a yet higher flight. He became a spiritualist, with Celia for his medium. The thought-reading entertainments became thrilling séances, and the beautiful child, now grown into a beautiful girl of 17, created a greater sensation as a medium in a trance than she had done as a lightning thought reader. I saw no harm in it, Celia explained to Mlle Celia, without any attempt at extenuation. I never understood that we might be doing any hurt to anyone. People were interested. They were to find us out if they could, and they tried to and they couldn't. I looked upon it quite simply in that way. It was just my profession. I accepted it without any question. I was not troubled about it until I came to Aix. A startling exposure, however, at Cambridge discredited the craze for spiritualism, and Captain Harland's fortunes declined. He crossed with his daughter to France and made a disastrous tour in that country, wasted the last of his resources in the casino at Dieppe, and died in that town, leaving Celia just enough money to bury him and to pay her third-class fare to Paris. There she lived honestly but miserably. The slimness of her figure and a grace of movement which was particularly hers obtained her at last a situation as a mannequin in the showrooms of a modiste. She took a room on the top floor of a house in the Rue Street Honoré and settled down to a hard and penurious life. I was not happy or contented, no, said Celia frankly and decisively. The long hours in the close rooms gave me headaches and made me nervous. I had not the temperament. And I was very lonely. My life had been so different. I had had fresh air, good clothes, and freedom. Now all was changed. I used to cry myself to sleep up in my little room, wondering whether I would ever have friends. You see, I was quite young, only 18, and I wanted to live. A change came in a few months, but a disastrous change. The modiste failed. Celia was thrown out of work, and could get nothing to do. Gradually she pawned what clothes she could spare, and then there came a morning when she had a single 5-franc piece in the world and owed a month's rent for her room. She kept the 5-franc piece all day and went hungry, seeking for work. In the evening she went to a provision shop to buy food, and the man behind the counter took the 5-franc piece. He looked at it, rung it on the counter, and, with a laugh, bent it easily in half. "See here, my little one," he said, tossing the coin back to her, "one does not buy good food with lead." Celia dragged herself out of the shop in despair. She was starving. She dared not go back to her room. The thought of the concierge at the bottom of the stairs, insistent for the rent, frightened her. She stood on the pavement and burst into tears. A few people stopped and watched her curiously, and went on again. Finally a sergeant de ville told her to go away. The girl moved on with the tears running down her cheeks. She was desperate, she was lonely. "I thought of throwing myself into the Seine," said Celia simply, in telling her story to the juge d'instruction. "Indeed, I went to the river. But the water looked so cold, so terrible, and I was young. I wanted so much to live. And then, the night came, and the lights made the city bright, and I was very tired and, in a word, the young girl went up to Montmartre in desperation, as quickly as her tired legs would carry her. She walked once or twice timidly past the restaurants, and, finally, entered one of them, hoping that someone would take pity on her and give her some supper. She stood just within the door of the supper room. People pushed past her, men in evening dress, women in bright frocks and jewels. No one noticed her. She had shrunk into a corner, rather hoping not to be noticed, now that she had come. But the novelty of her surroundings wore off. She knew that for want of food she was almost fainting. There were 2 girls engaged by the management to dance amongst the tables while people had supper, one dressed as a page in blue satin, and the other as a Spanish dancer. Both girls were kind. They spoke to Celia between their dances. They let her waltz with them. Still no one noticed her. She had no jewels, no fine clothes, no chic, the 3 indispensable things. She had only youth and a pretty face. "But," said Celia, "without jewels and fine clothes and chic these go for nothing in Paris." At last, however, Madame Dovry came in with a party of friends from a theatre, and saw how unhappy I was, and gave me some supper. She asked me about myself, and I told her. She was very kind, and took me home with her, and I cried all the way in the carriage. She kept me a few days, and then she told me that I was to live with her, for often she was lonely too, and that if I would she would someday find me a nice, comfortable husband and give me a marriage portion. So all my troubles seemed to be at an end, said Celia, with a smile. Within a fortnight Madame Dovry confided to Celia that there was a new fortune teller come to Paris, who, by looking into a crystal, could tell the most wonderful things about the future. The old woman's eyes kindled as she spoke. She took Celia to the fortune-teller's rooms next day, and the girl quickly understood the ruling passion of the woman who had befriended her. It took very little time then for Celia to notice how easily Madame Dovry was duped, how perpetually she was robbed. Celia turned the problem over in her mind. Madame had been very good to me. She was kind and simple, said Celia, with a very genuine affection in her voice. The people whom we knew laughed at her, and were ungenerous. But there are many women whom the world respects who are worse than ever was poor Madame Dovry. I was very fond of her, so I proposed to her that we should hold a séance, and I would bring people from the spirit world. I knew that I could amuse her with something much more clever and more interesting than the fortune tellers. And at the same time I could save her from being plundered. That was all I thought about. That was all she thought about, yes, she left Helene Vauquier out of her calculations, and she did not foresee the effect of her stances upon Madame Dovry. Celia had no suspicions of Helene Vauquier. She would have laughed if anyone had told her that this respectable and respectful middle-aged woman, who was so attentive, so neat, so grateful for any kindness, was really nursing a rancorous hatred against her. Celia had sprung from Montmartre suddenly, therefore Helene Vauquier despised her. Celia had taken her place in Madame Dovry's confidence, had deposed her unwittingly, had turned the confidential friend into a mere servant, therefore Helene Vauquier hated her. And her hatred reached out beyond the girl, and embraced the old, superstitious, foolish woman, whom a young and pretty face could so easily beguile. Helene Vauquier despised them both, hated them both, and yet must nurse her rancor in silence and futility. Then came the séances, and at once, to add fuel to her hatred, she found herself stripped of those gifts and commissions which she had exacted from the herd of common tricksters who had been wont to make their harvest out of Madame Dovry. Helene Vauquier was avaricious and greedy, like so many of her class. Her hatred of Celia, her contempt for Madame Dovry, grew into a very delirium. But it was a delirium she had the cunning to conceal. She lived at white heat, but to all the world she had lost nothing of her calm. Celia did not foresee the hatred she was arousing, nor, on the other hand, did she foresee the overwhelming effect of these spiritualistic séances on Madame Dovry. Celia had never been brought quite close to the credulous before. There had always been the row of footlights, she said. I was on the platform, the audience was in the hall, or, if it was at a house, my father made the arrangements. I only came in at the last moment, played my part, and went away. It was never brought home to me that some amongst these people really and truly believed. I did not think about it. Now, however, when I saw Madame Dovry so feverish, so excited, so firmly convinced that great ladies from the spirit world came and spoke to her, I became terrified. I had aroused a passion which I had not suspected. I tried to stop the séances, but I was not allowed. I had aroused a passion which I could not control. I was afraid that Madame Dovry's whole life, it seems absurd to those who did not know her, but those who did will understand. Yes, her whole life and happiness would be spoilt if she discovered that what she believed in was all a trick. She spoke with a simplicity and a remorse which it was difficult to disbelieve. M. Fleuriot, the judge, now at last convinced that the Dreyfus affair was for nothing in the history of this crime, listened to her with sympathy. That is your explanation, mademoiselle, he said gently. But I must tell you that we have another. Yes, monsieur? Celia asked. Given by Helene Vauquier, said Fleuriot. Even after these days Celia could not hear that woman's name without a shudder of fear and a flinching of her whole body. Her face grew white, her lips dry. I know, monsieur, that Helene Vauquier is not my friend, she said. I was taught that very cruelly. Listen, mademoiselle, to what she says, said the judge, and he read out to Celia an extract or two from Hanaud's report of his first interview with Helene Vauquier in her bedroom at the Villa Rose. You hear what she says. Madame Dovry would have had séances all day, but Mlle Celia pleaded that she was left exhausted at the end of them. But Mlle Celia was of an address. And again, speaking of Madame Dovry's queer craze that the spirit of Madame de Montespan should be called up, Helene Vauquier says, she was never gratified. Always she hoped. Always Mlle Celia tantalized her with the hope. She would not spoil her fine affairs by making these treats too common. Thus she attributes your reluctance to multiply your experiments to a desire to make the most profit possible out of your wares, like a good business woman. It is not true, monsieur, cried Celia earnestly. I tried to stop the séances because now for the first time I recognized that I had been playing with a dangerous thing. It was a revelation to me. I did not know what to do. Madame Dovry would promise me everything, give me everything, if only I would consent when I refused. I was terribly frightened of what would happen. I did not want power over people. I knew it was not good for her that she should suffer so much excitement. No, I did not know what to do. And so we all moved to Aix. And there she met Harry Wethermill on the second day after her arrival, and proceeded straightway for the first time to fall in love. To Celia it seemed that at last that had happened for which she had so longed. She began really to live as she understood life at this time. The day, until she met Harry Wethermill, was one flash of joyous expectation, the hours when they were together a time of contentment which thrilled with some chance meeting of the hands into an exquisite happiness. Madame Dovry understood quickly what was the matter, and laughed at her affectionately. Celia, my dear, she said, your friend, M. Wethermill Harry, is it not? See, I pronounce your tongue, will not be as comfortable as the nice, fat, bourgeois gentleman I meant to find for you. But, since you are young, naturally you want storms. And there will be storms, Celia, she concluded, with a laugh. Celia blushed. I suppose there will, she said regretfully. There were, indeed, moments when she was frightened of Harry Wethermill, but frightened with the delicious thrill of knowledge that he was only stern because he cared so much. But in a day or two there began to intrude upon her happiness a stinging dissatisfaction with her past life. At times she fell into melancholy, comparing her career with that of the man who loved her. At times she came near to an extreme irritation with Helene Vauquier. Her lover was in her thoughts. As she put it herself, I wanted always to look my best, and always to be very good. Good in the essentials of life that is to be understood. She had lived in a lax world. She was not particularly troubled by the character of her associates, she was untouched by them, she liked her fling at the baccarat tables. These were details, and did not distress her. Love had not turned her into a Puritan. But certain recollections plagued her soul. The visit to the restaurant at Montmartre, for instance, and the séances. Of these, indeed, she thought to have made an end. There were the baccarat rooms, the beauty of the town and the neighborhood to distract Madame Dovry. Celia kept her thoughts away from séances. There was no séance as yet held in the Villa Rose. And there would have been none but for Helene Vauquier. One evening, however, as Harry Wethermill walked down from the circle to the Villa des Fleurs, a woman's voice spoke to him from behind. Monsieur. He turned and saw Madame Dovry's maid. He stopped under a street lamp, and said, Well, what can I do for you? The woman hesitated. I hope Monsieur will pardon me, she said humbly. I am committing a great impertinence. But I think Monsieur is not very kind to Mlle Celia. Wethermill stared at her. What on earth do you mean? He asked angrily. Helene Vauquier looked him quietly in the face. It is plain, Monsieur, that Mlle Celia loves Monsieur. Monsieur has led her on to love him. But it is also plain to a woman with quick eyes that Monsieur himself cares no more for Mademoiselle than for the button on his coat. It is not very kind to spoil the happiness of a young and pretty girl, Monsieur. Nothing could have been more respectful than the manner in which these words were uttered. Wethermill was taken in by it. He protested earnestly, fearing lest the maid should become an enemy. Helene, it is not true that I am playing with Mlle Celia. Why should I not care for her? Helene Vauquier shrugged her shoulders. The question needed no answer. Why should I seek her so often if I did not care? And to this question Helene Vauquier smiled, a quiet, slow, confidential smile. What does Monsieur want of Madame Dovry? She asked. And the question was her answer. Wethermill stood silent. Then he said abruptly, nothing. Of course, nothing. And he walked away, but the smile remained on Helene Vauquier's face. What did they all want of Madame Dovry? She knew very well. It was what she herself wanted with other things. It was money, always money. Wethermill was not the first to seek the good graces of Madame Dovry through her pretty companion. Helene Vauquier went home. She was not discontented with her conversation. Wethermill had paused long enough before he denied the suggestion of her words. She approached him a few days later a second time and more openly. She was shopping in the Rue du Casino when he passed her. He stopped of his own accord and spoke to her. Helene Vauquier kept a grave and respectful face. But there was a pulse of joy at her heart. He was coming to her hand. Monsieur, she said, you do not go the right way. And again her strange smile illuminated her face. Mlle Celia sets a guard about Madame Dovry. She will not give to people the opportunity to find Madame generous. Oh, said Wethermill slowly. Is that so? And he turned and walked by Helene Vauquier's side. Never speak of Madame Dovry's wealth, Monsieur, if you would keep the favor of Mlle Celia. She is young, but she knows her world. I have not spoken of money to her, replied Wethermill, and then he burst out laughing. But why should you think that I of all men want money? He asked. And Helene answered him again enigmatically. If I am wrong, Monsieur, I am sorry, but you can help me too, she said, in her submissive voice. And she passed on, leaving Wethermill rooted to the ground. It was a bargain she proposed, the impertinence of it. It was a bargain she proposed, the value of it. In that shape ran Harry Wethermill's thoughts. He was in desperate straits, though to the world's eye he was a man of wealth. A gambler, with no inexpensive tastes, he had been always in need of money. The rights in his patent he had mortgaged long ago. He was not an idler, he was no sham foisted as a great man on an ignorant public. He had really some touch of genius, and he cultivated it assiduously. But the harder he worked, the greater was his need of gaiety and extravagance. Gifted with good looks and a charm of manner, he was popular alike in the great world and the world of Bohemia. He kept and wanted to keep a foot in each. That he was in desperate straits now, probably Helene Vauquier alone in Aix had recognized. She had drawn her inference from one simple fact. Wethermill asked her at a later time when they were better acquainted how she had guessed his need. Monsieur, she replied, you were in Aix without a valet, and it seemed to me that you were of that class of men who would never move without a valet so long as there was money to pay his wages. That was my first thought. Then when I saw you pursue your friendship with Mlle Celia, you, who so clearly to my eyes did not love her, I felt sure. On the next occasion that the two met, it was again Harry Wethermill who sought Helene Vauquier. He talked for a minute or two upon indifferent subjects, and then he said quickly, I suppose Madame Dovry is very rich? She has a great fortune in jewels, said Helene Vauquier. Wethermill started. He was agitated that evening, the woman saw. His hands shook, his face twitched. Clearly he was hard put to it. For he seldom betrayed himself. She thought it time to strike. Jewels which she keeps in the safe in her bedroom, she added. Then why don't you? He began, and stopped. I said that I too needed help, replied Helene, without a ruffle of her composure. It was 9 o'clock at night. Helene Vauquier had come down to the casino with a wrap for Madame Dovry. The two people were walking down the little street of which the casino blocks the end. And it happened that an attendant at the casino, named Alphonse Roule, passed them, recognized them both, and smiled to himself with some amusement. What was Wethermill doing in company with Madame Dovry's maid? Roule had no doubt. Roule had seen Wethermill often enough these recent days with Madame Dovry's pretty companion. Roule had all a Frenchman's sympathy with lovers. He wished them well, those two young and attractive people, and hoped that the maid would help their plans. But as he passed he caught a sentence spoken suddenly by Wethermill. "Well, it is true, I must have money." And the agitated voice and words remained fixed in his memory. He heard, too, a warning hush from the maid. Then they passed out of his hearing. But he turned and saw that Wethermill was talking volubly. What Harry Wethermill was saying he was saying in a foolish burst of confidence. You have guessed it, Helene, you alone. He had mortgaged his patent twice over, once in France, once in England, and the second time had been a month ago. He had received a large sum down, which went to pay his pressing creditors. He had hoped to pay the sum back from a new invention. But Helene, I tell you, he said, I have a conscience. And when she smiled he explained. Oh, not what the priests would call a conscience, that I know. But nonetheless I have a conscience about the things which really matter, at all events to me. There is a flaw in that new invention. It can be improved, I know that. But as yet I do not see how, and I cannot help it. I must get it right. I cannot let it go imperfect when I know that it's imperfect, when I know that it can be improved, when I am sure that I shall sooner or later hit upon the needed improvement. That is what I mean when I say I have a conscience. Helena Vauquier smiled indulgently. Men were queer fish. Things which were really of no account troubled and perplexed them and gave them sleepless nights. But it was not for her to object, since it was one of these queer anomalies which was giving her chance. And the people are finding out that you have sold your rights twice over, she said sympathetically. That is a pity, monsieur. They know, he answered, those in England know. And they are very angry? They threaten me, said Wethermill. They give me a month to restore the money. Otherwise there will be disgrace, imprisonment, penal servitude. Helene Vauquier walked calmly on. No sign of the intense joy which she felt was visible in her face, and only a trace of it in her voice. Monsieur will, perhaps, meet me tomorrow in Geneva, she said. And she named a small café in a back street. I can get a holiday for the afternoon. And as they were near to the villa and the lights, she walked on ahead. Wethermill loitered behind. He had tried his luck at the tables and had failed. And he must have the money. He travelled, accordingly, the next day to Geneva, and was there presented to Adèle Tace and Hippolyta. They are trusted friends of mine, said Helene Vauquier to Wethermill, who was not inspired to confidence by the sight of the young man with the big ears and the plastered hair. As a matter of fact, she had never met them before they came this year to Aix. The Tace family, which consisted of Adèle and her husband and Jeanne, her mother, were practiced criminals. They had taken the house in Geneva deliberately in order to carry out some robberies from the great villas on the lakeside. But they had not been fortunate, and a description of Madame Dovry's jewelry in the woman's column of a Geneva newspaper had drawn Adèle Tace over to Aix. She had set about the task of seducing Madame Dovry's maid, and found a master, not an instrument. In the small café on that afternoon of July, Helene Vauquier instructed her accomplices, quietly and methodically, as though what she proposed was the most ordinary stroke of business. Once or twice subsequently Wethermill, who was the only safe go-between, went to the house in Geneva, altering his hair and wearing a moustache, to complete the arrangements. He maintained firmly at his trial that at none of these meetings was there any talk of murder. To be sure, said the judge, with a savage sarcasm. In decent conversation there is always a reticence. Something is left to be understood. And it is difficult to understand how murder could not have been an essential part of their plan, but let us see what happened. Chapter 16 The First Move. On the Friday before the crime was committed, Madame Dovry and Celia dined at the Villa des Fleurs. While they were drinking their coffee, Harry Wethermill joined them. He stayed with them until Madame Dovry was ready to move, and then all three walked into the baccarat rooms together. But there, in the throng of people, they were separated. Harry Wethermill was looking carefully after Celia, as a good lover should. He had, it seemed, no eyes for anyone else, and it was not until a minute or two had passed that the girl herself noticed that Madame Dovry was not with them. "We will find her easily," said Harry. "Of course," replied Celia. "There is, after all, no hurry," said Wethermill, with a laugh, "and perhaps she was not unwilling to leave us together." Celia dimpled to a smile. "Madame Dovry is kind to me," she said, with a very pretty timidity. "And yet more kind to me," said Wethermill in a low voice which brought the blood into Celia's cheeks. But even while he spoke, he soon caught sight of Madame Dovry standing by one of the tables, and near to her was Adele Tace. Adele had not yet made Madame Dovry's acquaintance, that was evident. She was apparently unaware of her, but she was gradually edging towards her. Wethermill smiled, and Celia caught the smile. "What is it?" she asked, and her head began to turn in the direction of Madame Dovry. "Why, I like your frock, that's all," said Wethermill at once, and Celia's eyes went down to it. "Do you?" she said, with a pleased smile. It was a dress of dark blue which suited her well. "I am glad. I think it is pretty." And they passed on. Wethermill stayed by the girl's side throughout the evening. Once again he saw Madame Dovry and Adele Tace. But now they were together, now they were talking. The first step had been taken. Adele Tace had scraped acquaintance with Madame Dovry. Celia saw them almost at the same moment. "Oh, there is Madame Dovry," she cried, taking a step towards her. Wethermill detained the girl. "She seems quite happy," he said, and, indeed, Madame Dovry was talking volubly and with the utmost interest, the jewels sparkling about her neck. She raised her head, saw Celia, nodded to her affectionately, and then pointed her out to her companion. Adele Tace looked the girl over with interest and smiled contentedly. There was nothing to be feared from her. Her youth, her very daintiness, seemed to offer her as the easiest of victims. "You see, Madame Dovry does not want you," said Harry Wethermill. "Let us go and play chemin de fer," and they did, moving off into one of the further rooms. It was not until another hour had passed that Celia rose and went in search of Madame Dovry. She found her still talking earnestly to Adele Tace. Madame Dovry got up at once. "Are you ready to go, dear?" she asked, and she turned to Adele Tace. "This is Celia, Madame Rossignol," she said, and she spoke with a marked significance and a note of actual exultation in her voice. Celia, however, was not unused to this tone. Madame Dovry was proud of her companion, and had a habit of showing her off, to the girl's discomfort. The three women spoke a few words, and then Madame Dovry and Celia left the rooms and walked to the entrance doors. But as they walked, Celia became alarmed. She was by nature extraordinarily sensitive to impressions. It was to that quick receptivity that the success of the great Fortinbras had been chiefly due. She had a gift of rapid comprehension. It was not that she argued, or deducted, or inferred. But she felt. To take a metaphor from the work of the man she loved, she was a natural receiver. So now, although no word was spoken, she was aware that Madame Dovry was greatly excited, greatly disturbed, and she dreaded the reason of that excitement and disturbance. While they were driving home in the motor car, she said apprehensively, "You met a friend then, tonight, madam?" "No," said Madame Dovry, "I made a friend. I had not met Madame Rossignol before. A bracelet of hers came undone, and I helped her to fasten it. We talked afterwards. She lives in Geneva. Madame. Dovry was silent for a moment or two. Then she turned impulsively and spoke in a voice of appeal. Celia, we talked of things, and the girl moved impatiently. She understood very well what were the things of which Madame Dovry and her new friend had talked. And she laughed. I could not bear it. Celia was silent, and Madame Dovry went on in a voice of awe. I told her of the wonderful things which happened when I sat with Helene in the dark, how the room filled with strange sounds, how ghostly fingers touched my forehead and my eyes. She laughed. Adèle Rossignol laughed. Celia. I told her of the spirits with whom we held converse. She would not believe. Do you remember the evening, Celia, when Madame de Castiglione came back, an old woman, and told us how, when she had grown old and had lost her beauty and was very lonely, she would no longer live in the great house which was so full of torturing memories, but took a small appartement nearby, where no one knew her, and how she used to walk out late at night, and watch, with her eyes full of tears, the dark windows which had been once so bright with light? Adèle Rossignol would not believe. I told her that I had found the story afterwards in a volume of memoirs. Adèle Rossignol laughed and said, no doubt you had read that volume yourself before the séance. Celia stirred guiltily. She had no faith in you, Celia. It made me angry, dear. She said that you invented your own tests. She sneered at them. A string across a cupboard, a child, she said, could manage that, much more, than a clever young lady. Oh, she admitted that you were clever. Indeed, she urged that you were far too clever to submit to the tests of someone you did not know. I replied that you would. I was right, Celia, was I not? And again the appeal sounded rather piteously in Madame Dovry's voice. Tests, said Celia, with a contemptuous laugh. And, in truth, she was not afraid of them. Madame Dovry's voice at once took courage. There, she cried triumphantly. I was sure. I told her so. Celia, I arranged with her that next Tuesday. And Celia interrupted quickly. No. Oh, no. Again there was silence, and then Madame Dovry said gently, but very seriously. Celia, you are not kind. Celia was moved by the reproach. Oh, madam, she cried eagerly. Please don't think that. How could I be anything else to you who are so kind to me? Then prove it, Celia. On Tuesday I have asked Madame Rossignol to come, and the old woman's voice became tremulous with excitement. And perhaps, who knows? Perhaps she will appear to us. Celia had no doubt who she was. She was Madame de Montespan. Oh, no, madam, she stammered. Here, at Aix, we are not in the spirit for such things. And then, in a voice of dread, Madame Dovry asked, is it true, then, what Adèle said? And Celia started violently. Madame Dovry doubted. I believe it would break my heart, my dear, if I were to think that, if I were to know that you had tricked me, she said, with a trembling voice. Celia covered her face with her hands. It would be true. She had no doubt of it. Madame Dovry would never forgive herself, would never forgive Celia. Her infatuation had grown so to engross her that the rest of her life would surely be embittered. It was not merely a passion, it was a creed as well. Celia shrank from the renewal of these séances. Every fibre in her was in revolt. They were so unworthy of Harry Wethermill, and of herself as she now herself wished to be. But she had to pay now, the moment for payment had come. Celia, said Madame Dovry, it isn't true. Surely it isn't true? Celia drew her hands away from her face. Let Madame Rossignol come on Tuesday, she cried, and the old woman caught the girl's hand and pressed it with affection. Oh, thank you. Thank you, she cried. Adèle Rossignol laughs tonight, we shall convince her on Tuesday, Celia. Celia, I am so glad. And her voice sank into a solemn whisper, pathetically ludicrous. It is not right that she should laugh. To bring people back through the gates of the spirit world. That is wonderful. To Celia the sound of the jargon learnt from her own lips, used by herself so thoughtlessly in past times, was odious. For the last time, she pleaded to herself. All her life was going to change, though no word had yet been spoken by Harry Wethermill, she was sure of it. Just for this one last time, then, so that she might leave Madame Dovry the colours of her belief, she would hold a séance at the Villa Rose. Madame Dovry told the news to Helene Vauquier when they reached the villa. "You will be present, Helene," she cried excitedly. "It will be Tuesday. There will be the three of us." "Certainly, if Madame wishes," said Helene submissively. She looked round the room. Mlle Celia can be placed on a chair in that recess and the curtains drawn, whilst we, Madame and Madame's friend and I can sit round this table under the side windows. "Yes," said Celia, "it will do very well." It was Madame Dovry's habit when she was particularly pleased with Celia to dismiss her maid quickly, and to send her to brush the girl's hair at night, and in a little while on this night Helene went to Celia's room. While she brushed Celia's hair she told her that Servatas's parents lived at Chambéry, and that he would like to see them. "But the poor man is afraid to ask for a day," she said. "He has been so short a time with Madame." "Of course Madame will give him a holiday if he asks," replied Celia with a smile. "I will speak to her myself tomorrow." "It would be kind of Mademoiselle," said Helene Vauquier. But perhaps she stopped. "Well," said Celia, "perhaps Mademoiselle would do better still to speak to Servatas himself and encourage him to ask with his own lips. Madame has her moods, is it not so? She does not always like it to be forgotten that she is the mistress." On the next day accordingly Celia did speak to Servatas, and Servatas asked for his holiday. "But of course, Madame Dovry at once replied. We must decide upon a day." It was then that Helene Vauquier ventured humbly upon a suggestion. "Since Madame has a friend coming here on Tuesday, perhaps that would be the best day for him to go. Madame would not be likely to take a long drive that afternoon." "No, indeed," replied Madame Dovry. "We shall all three dine together early in Aix and return here." "Then I will tell him he may go tomorrow," said Celia. For this conversation took place on the Monday, and in the evening Madame Dovry and Celia went as usual to the Villa des Fleurs and dined there. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hoped you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists go to pixabay.com. Sheila.